Hi everyone, welcome to the February 21st edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Mulkowski, and we're recording one day later than usual due to that holiday Monday, although not too many tracks running on that Monday day of racing. I don't think we're going to really talk about any races from Monday, but I know Craig maybe a little day late getting some of those speed figures out, so wanted to make sure we had all those before we recorded, because plenty of racing taking place last Saturday and Sunday, primarily Saturday down in Louisiana at Fairgrounds. That's going to be where we spend the bulk of our show recapping that Risen Star card, that race in particular, adding a little bit of clarity to a very muddled Kentucky Derby picture. I think things are starting to take shape after that race took place. Some major contenders participating there and sort of sorting out the pecking order on the racetrack. Also in Oaks Prep at Fairgrounds, the Rachel Alexandra. We'll talk about the other stakes action that we mentioned on the forecast last week. Not our best forecast of opinions, although I think Craig maybe had a couple better ones than I did, but definitely some races that are worth discussing as we look back at those stakes performances. Also some races on the undercard at Fairgrounds that achieved some noteworthy speed figures, so we'll go through all of that. Some other venues that we'll mention later in the podcast are Laurel, where they ran the General George on Saturday, Gulfstream, an impressive debut winner on their Saturday card, as well as the Grade 3 Royal Delta. And then we'll finish things up with a couple of stakes at Aqueduct and one from Turfway. But Craig, like I said, the bulk of the action was at Fairgrounds, and the Risen Star was the centerpiece. It was the race that culminated that card, and it definitely lived up to the hype, as Sierra Leone, I think, has established himself at this point as the early favorite for the Kentucky Derby.
Yeah, I would guess that he is. I'm glad you do that Derby watch and not me, because I don't really track those things. But it was an impressive performance, and visually especially. And I think he had some things going against him as well. It was a race that we have coded in blue at TimeformUS. The fractions were definitely on the slow side, particularly in the middle of the race. But maybe, and I'll be curious about your opinion on this, the blinkers seemed to, at the very least, they certainly didn't hurt, and maybe helped a little bit, as he actually got into the race right around the time it was kind of taking a nosedive in the pace figure line, and just really was able to finish off the race as he increased from, I think the 6 furlong call wasn't even at the 100 mark. It might even been low 90s if memory serves, all the way to a 106 finish. We used the P notation for this race, upgraded his figure to a 111. So good, strong run from him. I would have liked to have seen a faster race, but given the way it's set up, I'm not going to hold the number against him very much, because I did like what I saw.
Yeah, Craig, I have to imagine it was difficult to make speed figures for this Fairgrounds card. I mean, obviously, with it being a 14 race card, it was run over such a long period of time, starting early in the day and extending up until, the evening after sundown. And also, with a muddy track or a sloppy track, I mean, it can change throughout the day. It's hard to really be sure when there's so much moisture in the track, drying out, different conditions, temperatures dropping. You're not really sure how that's affecting the track surface. And then later in the day, you had a couple of those turf races in between things. And on top of all of that, like you were saying, the slow pace of this Risen Star, it really made it difficult for the race to achieve any kind of fast speed figure. I mean, it's a little surprising they went as slowly as they did early, especially given that it was a 12-horse field, and it appeared that there were some horses in there that would have shown a little more speed, and they just kind of let Track Phantom set his own comfortable pace on the front end. And yeah, dropping down to a 92 pace figure for that 3/4 mark. I mean, they really slowed things down in the middle of this race, and I think that just upgrades the performance of Sierra Leone, who really did have to kick in the stretch to make up the ground that he had to do in the last quarter mile to get up for this victory. And most horses would not be able to accelerate like he did over a sloppy track. I think we saw that in some other races that we'll talk about a little bit later. But really strong finish from this horse. And yeah, I don't know if the blinkers made a big difference. He probably was a little bit closer to the pace than maybe you would have anticipated, given the way that he ran in the Remsen and reacted to some sloppy kickback that day. It didn't seem to be an issue for him whatsoever in this race. And he ran straight through the stretch. He's got this long, powerful stride. And once Tyler Gaffaleone produced him, he just mowed this field down. No question that Sierra Leone was the best horse in this race. I think the only question is, how strong was this race? And clearly the 111 TimeformUS speed figure is lower than you might have been expecting based on how strong this field appeared to be coming in. But I'm not going to base my assessment of this race on the figure too much, Craig, because given the pace, given the quality that we know some of these horses already possess, and the way in which Sierra Leone won, I get the sense this is a race that's probably better than the fig.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to get at. I'm not going to hold it against him too much because of the pace. I actually didn't do the figures for this card. My assistant did. He split the variant leader on in the card, which kind of made sense when you watched. It got dark. I would imagine that had some kind of effect, and I would have made the exact same call at the exact same point he did. So I have no issue with where he's split and the fact that he did split. So I'm okay with the figure. I will say, as high as I am on Sierra Leone, I'm pretty dubious on Track Phantom. Don't get me wrong, he's a good horse. It's just hard to find any real excuse. He had everything his own way, and just wasn't good enough over a sloppy track with a clear, easy lead. His speed figure, it's I don't want to hold it too harshly, but he regressed yet another point. So he seems like another horse that just kind of developed early. And I'm not sure there's a whole lot of upside with him as we move along this Derby trail.
Yeah, I would not give up on Track Phantom just yet. I agree had no excuse to lose this race. He was second best. Some might even argue he was third best in this race. We'll talk about some other also rans in just a little bit. But Track Phantom, Craig, I wonder if he's a horse that might actually be better if they made more use of his ample tactical speed. Because, I mean, we talked about it on the forecast last week. He's a horse who always breaks sharply from the gate. You can place him wherever you want him. He can go fast early and finish. I mean, I think the best race he ever ran was when he got real pace pressure in that gun runner back in December and had to put away those horses and still finish through the wire. I don't know if he's the kind of horse that wants to be rated so much on the front end and then be forced to sprint home. So I'm not going to give up on him just yet. I still think he's a horse that has a lot of attributes that really work in a race like the Kentucky Derby. And I mean, he's already got the points to get there. So, I mean, as long as he runs decently in the Louisiana Derby, you'd imagine that's where he's going to be headed. And I'm not going to write him off just yet, even though you would have wanted to see him win given the circumstances that he was presented with on Saturday. I mean, as for the third place finisher, Catching Freedom, I guess you could also say that he's one that was mildly compromised by the pace, but I've seen this tendency of his too many times, Craig, where he doesn't want to change leads. He's hopping over to his left lead in the stretch and just not really finishing. So he still has some greenness that I don't like to see at this stage.
Yeah, and I think it cost him. I mean, maybe he doesn't get up there in the photo, but he was only beaten a length and 3/4, and he just wasn't able to run straight. I assume because he wasn't changing leads and maybe getting a little bit tired. But I agree. By this point, I mean we're close to March. The Derby's not that far away. They would really need to get things sorted out with him. And I want to say I kind of agree. You make a good point about Track Phantom. Sometimes it gets overdone when these speed horses slow the race down like they did. Who knows if that horse, instead of running a 92 3/4, runs a 112, which he's certainly capable of doing. The closer's got to work a lot more to keep up. So I'll have to give that one another thought, especially considering, like you mentioned, how his best race came when he was pressed through pretty quick fractions.
Yeah, and I think you got to remember Steve Asmussen, he's been there before. And I think everyone around this horse knows that winning the Risen Star isn't critical. I mean, you want these horses to run well in these races. You want them to keep passing these tests, but you don't want to go to the bottom of the well in February. And this horse already has a lot of racing under his belt. So I just think that this is part of the overall trajectory of this horse's career. So I'll be interested to see where some of these go next. And I do want to give a mention to Honor Marie, Craig, because yes, he was also closing like Sierra Leone was. But when you watch this race, Honor Marie was always 3 to 4 lengths even behind Sierra Leone. And a horse that's that far back in a 12-horse field where there's no pace, he just had no chance to do anything in this race. He was always way out of position. He's one that I'm not going to be too hard on for this effort, and I'll be interested to see where he shows up next and if he's able to progress more in a race that features a little more pace, because I still think he's got some talent. This was just 100% the wrong setup for him.
Oh, for sure. The thing with a horse like him is he's running out of time because he doesn't have points. Who knows where the points are going to land this year, given the whole landscape of the Derby this year. But I would imagine he's only got one more prep race, and he's going to have to show up in that one.
Yeah, for sure. Let's move on to the race right before the Risen Star. That was the Oaks Prep, the Grade 2 Rachel Alexandra. And Craig, I would say great call on Tarifa, though I don't know if you really wanted to have Tarifa at with her paying just $7 to win, and not 7.90. That's $7 even, almost 2 to 1. Obviously, a big late hit on her to go from 6 to 1 loading into the gate down to 5 to 2 during the race. But we've seen that happen before, and I know everyone gets triggered when it happens on a horse that ultimately wins the race, especially in the dominant fashion that Tarifa did. But that late money, it typically is very smart, and we've seen that time and again. And Tarifa able to get the job done here, and just seems like a horse that is putting it all together for Brad Cox.
Yeah, she's definitely on the improve, and I don't want to kind of brush off what you said about the odds because I totally get people getting frustrated. I know I was. I mean, I was expecting a hit down. I think the DRF projected odds had the horse at 9 to 2 off of the 6 to 1 that she was basically as they broke from the gate. And to get only $7, I always say it's the only gambling game in the world right now where even the winners get mad sometimes. It's bad enough when you lose and you get mad, but to win and get mad is just very frustrating. And I hope that the people in charge of this game are taking some steps to do something about it. But outside of Naira cutting off the CRWs with 2 minutes to post, it doesn't even seem like it's on the radar. So not sure what's going to happen, but I imagine it's going to continue to be a point of frustration. As for the horse, she ran great. She didn't, even though she drew the rails, it's not like she saved a ton of ground, and she increased her speed figure from a 99 when she broke her maiden all the way up to a 105 and looked really good doing it. So she beat horses who I think ran fine. Intricate was coming off a layoff. I guess you could give that one a little bit of an excuse. Surely this wasn't the main goal for her, as we talked about the Risen Star. There's races coming up that are definitely more important, but no knocks at all on Tarifa. She ran a nice race. I was kind of expecting it from her, and she delivered. And I imagine we'll see her in the next round of preps at the fairgrounds.
Yeah, I mean, this was obviously a big step forward for Tarifa, and I think the remaining question with her is, can she do it on a fast track? Because we did see that flash of brilliance from her on debut, and she's sort of been trying to get back there ever since, and she did in this race, but it did come over a sloppy track, so you have that question in the back of your mind. Is she a horse that's going to run such an explosive race on a fast track? I guess we'll have to see about that, but this was obviously a big step in the right direction for her. As for Intricate, I agree. Just a horse that might have needed to start off the layoff, even though she was trading so well. You can't replicate a race in the morning, and she could have just been a horse that wasn't quite as sharp as we had seen her in her peak efforts last year. If she had after she had a couple of races under her belt, and also Craig, for Intricate, the complexion of this race really did change at the start when Pennick, who I think everybody, including the other riders in this race, would have expected to be on the lead, and she stumbled coming out of the gate, and they just kind of took her to the back of the pack, and it really changed how the pace was set up for everybody, and probably more so than anyone, Intricate, who was going to try to close from the back of the pack. And not that the pace completely held together, but Tarifa getting the first jump on Intricate, given the way this race unfolded, I think did play a significant role in the outcome.
Yeah, I forgot. I'm glad you mentioned that. I mean, the race totally changed before they had taken 3 strides, the way she just totally blew the brake. So agreed there. But I mean, it's not like Tarifa came from she was on the lead. I thought she was good, but I just don't want to chalk it up that she's a better horse than Intricate at this point. I think that's yet to be determined.
Let's talk about the other dirt stakes race on this card. Well, scheduled dirt race, dirt stakes race, I should say. That was the Grade 3 Mine Shaft, going the mile and a 16th distance, same as the Rachel Alexandra. This one for the older males as race 11 on the card. And a bit of an upset here, Craig, as Money Supply got the job done over the heavily favored Best Actor. This also produced a different pace scenario than I think we were expecting when we handicapped this race, as some other jockeys and connections must have looked at the PPs and said, oh, there's not a whole lot of speed in here. We better get more aggressive than we were originally planning to. And a couple of jockeys went after Best Actor in the early stages and forced this pace to get much faster than it looked like it would on paper. And that ultimately set things up for Money Supply, who just sat the perfect trip sitting in behind them.
Yeah, no doubt. The piece on paper looked like Best Actor was going to have things his own way, but Luis Saez and Johnny Velasquez had totally different ideas. And one challenged them. They both challenged them kind of early and really made them run. Some red fractions in this race, some 140 pace figures after a half mile. So it proved to be just a little bit too much for best actor. He ran great, got a 122 Timeform US speed figure, better than the winner. But Money Supply was able to keep that long winning streak he has intact. He got a 119 for the win.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any denying that Best Actor was the best horse in this race. To survive that pace pressure and really battle back when Money Supply challenged him in the lane, because at the 16th pole, it looked like Money Supply was on his way to a 2-length victory, and Best Actor really dug in to make it very close coming to the finish line. Actually, almost came back and grabbed the victory for himself. But when you look at, Gasoline as a quality horse, finished almost 4 lengths behind him, and the other speed, WNL, fading to last place. Nice performance from Best Actor. Money Supply, though, don't take nothing away from him. He got the trip, but he's also been in great form for Joe Sharp. This was his 4th victory in a row. Fifth victory in a row, as he's just been in great form, moving up the class ladder from claiming starter allowance races, and now this. In retrospect, I wonder if maybe the connections of Notary made a bit of a miscalculation scratching, because I had thought he had run a little better than Money Supply in the race where they faced off at Oaklawn, but he's scratched in favor of, I think it's the Razorback this weekend at Oaklawn Park, which came up a really tough race, probably a tougher race than this one. So interesting there. But Money Supply just able to take advantage of a field that was probably a little soft for the level.
Yeah, I made that same note about Notary because I was looking over the PPs for Saturday at Oaklawn and was wondering, he's going to have to run a better race than he would have to win this one, I think. So it will be interesting to see how it shows up. This older horse division, especially this time of year, it's always in just complete flux with the Dubai race and the Saudi race, not necessarily in that order, coming up soon. So hard to make a lot out of these races, but I would say Best Actor actually impressed me more in this race in defeat than he had in some of his wins.
I would agree with that. Let's talk about the 2 turf stakes races they ran at Fairgrounds on Saturday. The Grade 3 Fairgrounds went as race 12 for the older males, and basically the same exacta that we saw in the race run last month, the Colonel E.R. Bradley, just a different order, as Beatbox was able to run down Strong Quality this time, reversing the decision from last time. This was a tale of trips, I think, Craig, as Joel Rosario just did everything right on Beatbox, got him over to the inside, saved ground every step of the way. And I know there were only 2 turf races on Saturday at Fairgrounds, but it really did feel like that ground right down on the rail was where you wanted to be.
Definitely. And you could kind of see it in the times for a track that many thought was going to be a bog. I would say it was more good, maybe at worst yielding. It's labeled as soft. It was not a soft track. But a lot of that has to do with what you note. They took the rails down, which hadn't been used, I don't think, in a while. They ran on the inside, and that part of the course was pretty good, and it really paid off for Beatbox. Joel Rosario pulling off his patented move. Not sure why Florent Giroux left the rail open. He had every opportunity not to do so. And at the end of the day, it was the difference in the race. Maybe that and it just being an extra half furlong, it gave him the time to make up the distance. Beatbox ran a 121 Timeform US speed figure, Strong Quality, a little higher at 123 because of what was a pretty quick pace, but he did so mostly on his own.
And, we've given Joel Rosario some grief over the past year, Craig. I'm sure that 2023 was a year that he would rather forget, as well as just a lot of frustrations. He delivered some excellent rides on Saturday, and it seems like he's really been putting in some strong rides so far in 2024. So hopefully this is the start of a trend, because, there are few riders with the talent that Joel possesses when everything is, clicking for him and he's on his game. And I think we saw some of that in this Fairgrounds on Beatbox, as he just committed to that inside path and came right up on through. But watching this race, Craig, you really do see how beneficial the rail was, because the top 3 finishers, they all rode the rail. Strong Quality was setting the pace, Beatbox in behind, and Johnny's Fireball also on the inside, basically for the backstretch run and around the far turn. And some of them angled off it in the stretch. But when you spend most of your time on the rail, and that's the place to be, you typically have success in your races. And that's what happened here, as those 3 finished over 2 lengths ahead of the rest. And it was a race that was more dominated towards the front end, even though there are couple of red color-coded fractions. The top two are okay, Craig. I think they're going to face some tougher tests down the line, though, as these turf stakes races get a little more difficult later in the year.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
The other turf stakes on this card was the Albert Stahl Memorial, this one for the fillies and mares. And again, we saw a rail skimming ride be successful, and that one was delivered here by Flavien Prat on Spirit and Glory. And this was sort of the race where I think jockeys figured out where you wanted to be on the track, Craig, because this one occurred earlier in the day than the fairgrounds. And it seemed like most of the jockeys were assuming the rail was going to be bad, because even the riders on the leaders were keeping them well out into the track and the 3-4 path. And Flavien just put Spirit and Glory on the inside, cut the corner at the top of the stretch, and she moved up the inside like that was the place to be. And I think everyone in the next race learned from his example.
No doubt about that. So at least some of them did, for sure, namely Joel Rosario. And yeah, Spirit and Glory, she ran fine. I mean, I can't get too excited about this one. She only ran a 1:15 speed figure. She was the one who benefited the most from the trip. So she's fine. This was a listed stakes. That's the kind of figure it came back. I don't really think there's anybody in this field I would be itching to bet if they moved up in company.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it was a tale of circumstances that allowed Spirit and Glory to be the winner here. She just got the best trip overall. I don't know what was going on with Creative Cairo, who finished fourth in this race. She was the 5-2 favorite. I mean, she was dragged back to last early, which is how she runs. I mean, she comes from the back, but I mean, it was a completely different strategy than what Flavien Prat employed on Spirit and Glory that Florent Giroux did on Creative Cairo. It seemed like he wanted to ride this course like it was the middle of winter last year when you wanted to come down the outside rail. Probably not where you wanted to be on Saturday at Fairgrounds, but she actually did a lot of running in this stretch despite being about 10 wide through the lane.
Yeah, for sure. She was the horse who had absolutely no chance as I was watching the race. I mean, you couldn't even see her in the picture for a large part of the race. So not sure what was going on there, if it was horse or rider, but it didn't work out. And I guess she can cut a little slack because I don't really think the riders knew what they were getting into in that first turf race. But again, it really wasn't that slow. We have it rated a 6 on these 1 to 10 scale for turf condition ratings. This one might have been just a touch slower as the course was, I guess, drying out a little bit during the day, but couldn't have been much difference.
No, I mean, I'm not saying that Florent Giroux or the other riders should have known exactly where to be on the turf course when it's the first turf race of the day, but it's just kind of funny to watch the race in retrospect and see two completely different strategies, and one be successful and the other not so. Maybe Creative Cairo was the better horse. It would have been interesting to see how they could have done with opposite trips in that race. Well, there was supposed to be one more stakes run on the turf. They did take that one off. That was the scheduled turf sprint, the Colonel Power, which was instead run at 5.5 furlongs on the dirt. And that suited the winner, Minnesota Ready, just fine, Craig, as this horse probably is a better dirt horse. He's had more success on the dirt, and he certainly seemed to relish the sloppy going on Saturday, because that was quite a kick that he produced through the stretch.
It was. It's a horse who hadn't won since the summer at Ellis Park, but he's been running consistent speed figures in the teens. Jumped all the way up to a 120 here. I don't know if it was the slop. The final time figure was actually 123, as the early pace was pretty slow for this 5.5 furlong distance. And he beat the venerable Just Might, who is another horse who does well on both surfaces. Seems to be a little bit better on turf these days. I thought a few years ago maybe the opposite was different, but as he's gotten older, he's been more consistent on the turf. So I don't want to put too much into the 120 speed figure. It was fine. It was a good race, but it was only at 5.5 furlongs. So tough to know what to make of it being on a sloppy track as well.
Yeah, this was the first start for Minnesota Ready going out for the Tom Amos barn. I believe he's one of those horses that was sold as part of that Lothenbach Stables dispersal. He went for $380,000. I know that trainer Neil Pessin bought a few of these horses for himself. Minnesota Ready was not one of those, so he went out for new connections here in Tom Amos and seemed to take a step forward, though obviously he's a horse that really appreciated the conditions running in a race where most of the others were meant to do better on the turf. Let's talk about a couple of the non-stakes events on Saturday at Fairgrounds. One of those was an allowance race early in the day. I know there was some hype around what might transpire in this 3-year-old N1X, although that was before scratches, Craig, and there were some key scratches in this race that it ended up being just 3 runners participating in this third race on the card, and really one of them had no chance. So it was essentially a match race between Tuscan Sky and Nash, and Tuscan Sky came out on top in just the second start of his career, and positive sign to see this horse handle the 2 turns and defeat a accomplished horse like Nash, who is stakes placed and has run some nice speed figures up until this point. I'm still not quite sure what to make of this race. And I think that if you're just comparing the speed figure to that of the Risen Star later in the day, it might lead you astray, because running a fast figure in a basic match race is a lot different than running it in a 12-horse Derby prep.
For sure, and the pace probably had a lot to do with it. This did come before we broke out the variant. Obviously, it was much earlier on the card. It still came up noticeably faster, but as you said, a lot of that probably had to do with the pace. The early pace figure of 130 as Nash opened up on Tuscan Sky. It was a match race. The Hawks Creek, the third place finisher, was never in the race. I was impressed by Tuscan Sky in that normally when in a match race, the horse that gets a lead like Nash did, very tough to run down. And Tuscan Sky did it pretty easily over that sloppy track. So he's a horse with some talent, but I do agree with you. If he was to face off against Sierra Leone next, not like I'd be, it would just depend on the price. They're both very good horses, but I have a feeling Tuscan Sky is going to be overrated off this effort.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, both of his performances coming over wet tracks, I think the inclination by a lot of handicappers might be to say, oh, Tuscan Sky is just some wet track specialist. Watching his 2 wet track races, I don't even know if this horse likes a wet track. I mean, he seemed to resent the sloppy kickback on debut and only really did running once they got him out into the clear. And then in this race, he was never traveling as well as Nash early. And Nash is just a more handy, headstrong horse by nature than Tuscan Sky is. I think that's pretty apparent when you watch their races. But still, I mean, Luis Saez had to niggle after this horse almost every step of the way. And I think that is the way that you beat a horse like Nash, who travels well and wants to get comfortable on the front end, by forcing him to get a little uncomfortable, which I think is what you saw here in that third quarter mile when Luis Saez really pressed the pace and produced that red color-coded pace figure in the middle of this line. That's what probably allowed Tuscan Sky to win. Nice for him to get this victory, Craig. I will say it's a little surprising that there were 3 3-year-olds on this card that earned higher speed figures than the winner of the Risen Star, and we'll talk about the third of them in just a little bit. It does make me wonder if maybe this track changed a little more than we're even giving it credit for, but it's hard to say because obviously these early races, they went fast compared to the surrounding dirt races. It's just a 118 for Nash. To me, it feels really high. I don't know if I view him as a horse that can run a number like that. And it's hard to really have confidence in a race where there were only 2 horses and nobody getting in their way. I mean, maybe that's the reason for it. I mean, horses in the Risen Star, they had to overcome traffic, adversity, the stress of running in a large field. And these 2 just got to run their own races without any straw in their path. And maybe that's the reason for the high speed figures, but I'm definitely not taking these at face value.
Yeah, I was going to give that exact reason that you did. I think a lot of times you mentioned it, these horses were able to save ground most of the way, didn't have to deal with kickback, didn't have to deal with other horses. And that will often lead to better speed figures. One of the most interesting authors that I've read, because he's not mainstream here in the U.S., is a guy that wrote some books in England named Nick Morden, who I actually met at Saratoga several years back. And one of the things he talked about was how horses do in fields and how smaller fields help horses with speed figures. And it's something that's really stuck with me over the years. So yeah, a three horse field, I'm going to be a little bit leery of that figure being able to be repeated in a big field, which I would imagine we'll see in the Louisiana Derby.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to make because you're a speed figure maker, Craig. I'm somebody who uses speed figures prominently in my handicapping. We have a lot of respect for speed figures, but speed figures are not the be all and end all when you're assessing the quality of a performance or the quality of a horse. And sometimes it's just the ideal set of circumstances to produce a fast number. And other times an entire race comes up a little slower than you might expect. And there are factors at play that would account for that. And the number is not the ultimate deciding factor of quality. So I think that you've got to keep those context clues in mind when you're evaluating these performances.
Yeah, at the end of the day, speed figures are how fast did you get from point A to point B. We don't tell you how they got there. That's something that the handicapper has to take into account. We do give pace figures at TimeformUS to kind of give assessment of the flow, but yeah, you have to judge the rest.
And the other 3-year-old I was referring to who ran a figure faster than the winner of the Risen Star was Drip, who won the 7th race on this Saturday card at Fairgrounds. It was a maiden event. And this one's got to be a little difficult, Craig, because this was a field that was just dominated by first-time starters. And I know you always have a little cause for pause about races like this where a bunch of firsters get fast numbers. I can't see in the PPs right now if this race got the F designation or not, indicating that we lack a little confidence in the speed figure. But Drip, the winner, he was a horse that was touted coming into this race. For people that had watched some of the workouts, he had been outworking his stablemate Honor Marie, who ran the Risen Star. Now, Honor Marie, more of a 2-turn distance horse, and Drip, obviously one that is pretty fast as a sprinter. So not a big surprise there that this horse could put down some fast times in the morning. But clearly he was ready to fire on debut for this trainer, Whit Beckman, and earned a nice speed figure. But again, it was against a bunch of firsters, and it was over a sloppy track where we got to the front. So it's hard to know what this race means for this horse's future.
Yeah, it is tough. This didn't get the F designation because there were plenty of sprints run before this, and they were all very consistent. The variant change that I talked about where we thought the track slowed actually came after this one. So unless you thought the track suddenly got faster for this one and then slowed shortly after, which it's possible in an off track, but there's no way to really know. Fairly confident that the figures are good for this race, but who knows? Like you said, the first 5 were all first-time finishers. The 6th and 7th place horses regressed a few points, as did the 8th place finisher, but just barely. But it's good to see that the figures at least fit for all 3 of the horses that had run. They essentially, all 3 of them ran 2 or 3 points slower than they had in their previous race.
Yeah, and this was supposed to be a loaded maiden race, so I guess it's not a big surprise that it got a strong figure. I mean, not just that Whit Beckman touted firster, but Brad Cox had one in here that took money in Discreet Mischief. There was one going out for Todd Pletcher that finished 4th in this race. I mean, Discreet Mischief, who was 2nd, I thought he ran pretty well. He was the only horse to make up significant ground in this race, getting up for 2nd after closing from mid-pack. He's a horse that has some pedigree. He's, I think, a half-brother to a horse that was a stakes winner, a multiple stakes place on the turf, but he's by more of a dirt sire. Into Mischief, of course. The second dam of Discreet Mischief was actually a horse that people might remember from, I think, the late 90s, Manastique, who ran out in California. I think she got a bunch of fast speed figures and some 2-turn dirt routes at that point in time. So there's pedigree with that one. And as for the winner, Drip, I mean, I'm kind of viewing him as a sprinter right now based on how fast he ran in this debut race, but he is by good magic, and we've seen a lot of these good magics stretch out successfully. So maybe the jury's still out on what this horse can do. The one thing I did not like about Drip's victory, Craig, is that he never changed leads in the stretch. He just hung on his left lead all through the lane. So you do want to see a horse like that get a little more professional with those lead changes if they're going to stretch out in distance in the future.
Yeah, for sure. I could see that. I mean, I don't want to hold it against him too much as a first-time starter, but as you note, stretching out the 2 turns is when it really becomes important.
Well, Craig, you alerted me that I should not overlook some more Fairgrounds races that were run earlier in the week from that Mardi Gras card on Tuesday. 2 of them in particular, including the featured stakes race, the Mardi Gras, which was run on the turf. And this one won by the older filly, or older mare, I should say, 6-year-old mare, Overcharged, a Louisiana bred, who, I mean, she's proficient on the dirt, Craig, but she's run twice on the turf, and both have been just otherworldly performances, including this one where, I mean, she beat a really good horse in Ovra by over 5 lengths in fast time. I don't know how good this horse might ultimately turn out to be on the turf, but the connections might want to give more of a look to making her into a turf sprinter in the future.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. I mean, she got the highest TimeformUS speed figure of the week, a 126. I'll put a small asterisk next to that because it was over a course. This one was listed as good, but is only a 5 on the track condition scale, more like a yielding. I would say this was a slower course, than what we saw on Saturday, given how the rail played that day. But regardless of the number, maybe you think, oh, it's only a 120. That's pretty darn good for a mare like this. She absolutely blew this field away. As you said, she's done it before on the turf. She's clearly fast. I mean, she has no problem on dirt. She's won many races, but she's really good on turf. And as I look at the chart, all the other horses basically ran their figure or regressed a little bit in here. So I don't have too many problems with that figure, other than saying maybe the ground kind of gapped the horses a little bit more than you'd normally see. We account for that somewhat in Timeform US, but I don't think you can ever put an exact number on it.
Yeah, and this race was run at an about distance, and correct me if I'm wrong, Greg, but I believe that's because the rails were out this day on the turf course, and Fairgrounds does not time these races from a different starting position. I think they just do it based on the usual starting gate position, with the times coming up a little slower when the rails are out. But even though there's a weird 5 furlong fraction of this race that makes you kind of question the time a little bit, I did go and time this race from the gate against the other 5.5 furlong race on the card, just using, my crude stopwatch methods. And they totally match up in the gap between these races. So I don't think there's anything wrong with the time that Overcharged ran. And certainly the margin of victory would lead you to believe it was a very fast race, just as fast as it looks, because like you say, I mean, there were some good horses in behind her and she just walloped them. So really nice effort from her. And I'll be interested to see where she goes in the future. Let's talk about one more race from that Tuesday card at Fairgrounds. It was an allowance race run right before the Mardi Gras. And this one was won by the 3-year-old Doncho, who is now 2 for 2 in his career for trainer Michelle Lovell. This was a horse that attracted some buzz on debut when he was a 5-length winner that day, getting a 109 Timeform US speed figure. That one actually knocked down a little bit from a higher final time number. And then in this race, just did what he had to do to beat an inferior field, Craig. I wouldn't say that we necessarily learned anything new about this horse, but he clearly is a 3-year-old sprinter with some talent.
Yeah, I didn't want to overlook him. The figure actually regressed a little both times because of the pace being a little bit on the slow side, but he did everything as easily as could be. Didn't even get out of the gate that clean, but was able to make the lead fair heading into the turn, and just was no match. This was basically a paid workout. There was nobody who had run anywhere remotely close to him except for a horse named Agoo, who just didn't show up at all. He was the second choice, was basically last all the way around the track. And once that happened, it was all over for Doncho. This one's got some talent. As you said, I tend to think he's a sprinter when I watch his races. I didn't really look at his breeding that much. I think he was out of a horse named Motown, but he's one that definitely has some talent, and look forward to seeing him face some tougher competition.
Yeah, he's going to have to get a class test eventually, but this was a nice performance from him. He's just a horse that seems like he moves very powerfully, and he's got some quality to him. It's apparent when you watch his races, but we'll see if he can handle a faster pace situation, because I think the big question is he hasn't gotten a whole lot of pressure in his races, and he did sit off another horse here, but that's the ideal way to achieve a fast number, when you get to stalk a moderate pace and then finish in a sprint race. We'll see if he can be as successful in a race that features a faster pace. On to our next venue, Laurel Park, where on Saturday they ran some of their premier races of the wintertime, the General George and the Barbara Fritchie. We'll just talk about one of those because the Barbara Fritchie came up pretty weak this year. The General George arguably did as well, except for the winner Post Time, who went off as the prohibitive favorite and is turning into a really nice horse for Brittany Russell, Craig. I mean, this horse, I know we've talked about on the podcast before, I think actually both podcasts we've done, handicapping the race when he shipped to Keeneland. And he just shows up every time. He's now won 7 out of 8 races. He clearly is superior to whatever he's facing in Maryland at this point in time. And this race was going the 7 furlongs and didn't feature a whole lot of pace, but it didn't matter. He was able to overcome it. He just finishes so strongly through the wire. I wonder how good he can ultimately be, because it feels like it's overdue for him to get another class test.
It does. It's not like he ran badly at Keeneland. He ran fine. I think it was, he didn't quite run the speed figures that we've seen from him, but He's doing nothing but winning. He got a 120 TimeformUS speed figure here. He had run a 123 final time in the win. So he did it without much of a setup, as you say, because the early pace figures were really slow. Just a 101 opening quarter for a dirt graded stake sprint is not much. And it just didn't really matter to him. As you say, it wasn't the strongest field in behind, but it was okay. Most of the horses are capable of running figures north of 110. So not terrible. Nimitz class was in here, but that's a horse who seems to have gone off form since his big win back in September. But yeah, this horse is good. It's just a matter of how good, and we're not really going to know until he faces some better company.
Yeah, I mean, I actually really liked his performance at Keeneland in that Perryville. That was a race where maybe he didn't get the best ride. I think he was ridden perhaps a little too overconfidently that day, and arguably could have won that race under different circumstances. And I mean, that would have made him undefeated up until this point. But I mean, since then, he's been unstoppable. I was really impressed with his race two back going the 1-turn mile. And I know Brittany Russell was saying after this race that they do believe that this is a horse that can ultimately go route distances and maybe 2 turns. I don't know what the next step is going to be. I know Brittany Russell won the Carter last year at Aqueduct on Wood Memorial Day. The Carter, I think this year has been downgraded from a grade 1 to a grade 2, but still that would be a nice a race to check off the list before stretching out in distance a little further and getting a bigger class test. So we'll see where they go with him, but I'm a fan of this horse. He's pretty talented.
Yeah, no doubt about it. It's going to be interesting to see where he shows up. And even though all his races have been 1 turn, he certainly doesn't give the impression to me that 2 turns would be out of the question.
Let's move on to South Florida, where they ran a couple of races that we'll talk about from their Saturday card. First up is their stakes race on Saturday, the Grade 3 Royal Delta. This went as race 11 on the card, going the mile and a 16th distance. And Craig, I think we saw some of the the idiosyncrasies of this short stretch in the mile and a 16th over a mile and an eighth oval play out in this race, because Honor D Lady, I mean, she won this race comfortably in the end by 2 lengths, but she just got a way better trip than some of the other main rivals she had in this race. And it just seems like if you don't break out of the gate well and get position heading into that very short run to the clubhouse turn, going the mile and the 16th at Gulfstream, you've got no chance. And she got into good position under Jose Ortiz, and he actually made an early move around the far turn to break this race open. And there was just no time for anybody else to get near her in the end.
Yeah, it's really not the greatest setup, particularly to be running graded stakes races over, but I guess that's what they got to do. I'd rather see these races run at a mile and an eighth, give everybody a more fair advantage. Because, as you said, normally you can tell who's going to win these races after the first turn is over. And that was really kind of the case here. Early move by Jose Ortiz. It was a good effort by Honor D Lady. She ran a 117 TimeformUS speed figure. So since getting back on dirt, she's kind of clearly proved to me that it's her favorite surface. Her speed figures have just kept ascending. She was a horse that won the Remington Park Oaks here back in the fall time. And she's done very little wrong since. I thought her race in the Cumley was fine, and she took another step forward here. But hard to say how much stock I want to give her for winning at this weird setup.
Yeah, I don't think we mentioned the speed figure. I think she's supposed to get a 117 TimeformUS speed figure for this effort, which for her is good. It's another step forward, like you said. I mean, she's really been improving since getting back on the dirt, and it sort of validates that upset third place finish in the Cumley from last fall when she finished behind some good horses like Raging Sea and Julia Shining, who I hope are both staying in trading. I can't recall if I've seen reporting about both of them. They're well-bred horses who I think would do well to stay in this older filly and mare division as 4-year-olds. But as for Honor D Lady, who finished behind the two of them, just met the right field and got a better trip than some of her main rivals. And I'm particularly talking about Tizzy in the Sky, who was the 6-5 favorite. And I mean, through no fault of Irad Ortiz, I don't know what he could have done differently, but she just got bumped at the start, and you can't have that happen going this distance, because after that, she was out of position every step of the way, went 4 to 5 wide on the turn. That kind of trip is never going to be successful in this kind of race.
Yeah, I think that this one's a line through for her. A little concerning. I mean, it's 2 times in a row her speed figure hasn't been much. He definitely disappointed in the go for Wand as well. To me, even though I think we both like Dr. B that day, but she was really no match at all for that one. So even though I would say put a line through this one, I do think there's still some question marks on her current form.
Earlier in the day at Gulfstream, race 8 was a loaded maiden special weight event going the 1 turn mile distance. Some 3-year-olds who had already run against some nice runners that coming into this race, including Military Road, who went off as the favorite. He was the third place finisher in that much talked about Conquest Warrior maiden race from back in the middle of January. But it was the expensive first time starter going out for Chad Brown, Top Connor, who got the job done on debut. And Greg, I thought this horse showed a lot of likable attributes first time out. I mean, he was professional, sat behind horses, took kickback, and once Jose Ortiz wheeled him out at the top of the stretch, he produced a kick. This was a good effort.
It was a good effort. As you say, he drew the inside, which is usually not ideal for first time starters. But Jose Ortiz, who had a good day on Saturday, was able to work out a trip from the inside. And as you said, we don't often see that from first time starters a lot. He was able to take some dirt, didn't seem to matter. And he ran a nice speed figure, got a 105 for the effort. Final time was a 103, upgraded because it was a pretty quick pace and he was tucked in right behind it. So really nice effort on debut. And I would imagine when you debut at the 1 turn mile, they have plans to stretch this one out.
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, I'd heard that he was working really well coming into this race, and definitely the kind of horse that you might start thinking about how many weeks are left before now in the Kentucky Derby, because it's not really Chad Brown's style to rush a horse along to try to make a race like the Derby. But when you pay $1 million for a horse, I'm sure there's some incentive when the horse debuts this impressively in February to start to look at the stakes calendar and say, well, how can we get to one of those 100-point Derby preps? And we'll see what they decide to do with this horse and how he comes out of this race. But I mean, he's got a nice pedigree. I mean, I think he's by Twirling Candy. The Dam is a full sister to Divine Miss Gray, who earned nearly $1 million during her career. She was a multiple stakes winner, primarily routing on the dirt. So nice effort from him on debut. And also, I thought Military Road ran pretty well to be second. I mean, there was some pace that was setting him up, but he was finishing well along the inside. He seems like a horse that really is going to appreciate the opportunity to go 2 turns down the line. Let's move on to Aqueduct, where there are a couple of stakes races for 3-year-old fillies from last week that we want to discuss. One of those for Open Company. That was the Ruthless from Saturday. This one going 7 furlongs was won by Helena's Forte, shipping in for trainer Phil Bauer. And this is a horse that showed real quality in the first couple starts of her career at Churchill last year. Lost as the favorite at Fairgrounds, maybe didn't get the best trip that day, but got back on track in this race. Did get a very good trip, though, tracking off a pace that was fairly contested on the front end.
Yeah, she got a nice trip, but she is moving forward. She's improved her speed figure every time out, this time all the way up to a 105. Seems like this was the longest she's run yet at 7 furlongs. She's by Matoli, so seems like sprinting is going to remain what happens in her future. But 105 is pretty good for 3-year-old fillies this time of year, and I would imagine she's going to be moving up the class ladder pretty soon.
I'm actually a little more excited about Gallia Princess coming out of this race, Craig, and I would imagine you would agree because they were moving up front in this race. I know that the fractions might not look that fast in terms of raw times, but we're dealing with this Aqueduct main track, which has just been extremely slow for over a month now. I mean, a sub 47 half actually is pretty fast based on the way the track was playing last Saturday for the 7 furlong distance. And Gallia Prince was also getting plenty of pressure towards the front end, and the 2 horses that were chasing her, Reconcile, who had already run fast races in her prior 2 starts, she faded and lost this race by 15 lengths. Irella, she also faded after chasing this pace, and Gallia Princess did well to keep battling on for second in this race, and it's represented in the TimeformUS speed figure where she gets a bigger pace upgrade than the winner.
Yeah, she got a 109 overall TimeformUS speed figure, 4 points higher off a 3 points lower final time. And also on this card, we have it coded in blue as just being a bad day for speed. And when you look at the chart for this race, as you say, the other speeds are nowhere to be found. It's not like Kalina's forte came from way out of it, but she had the good trip tucked in behind, not in behind, but behind the duel. She was out in the track. So yeah, Gallia Princess, I would agree, is the one you want going forward out of this, but she's going to have to either learn to relax a little bit or handle pressure just a little better.
Yeah, there were so many biases at Aqueduct recently. I'm always on the lookout for when one might pop up due to weather or temperature circumstances. And initially, early in the day, I was kind of trying to figure out whether the rail was bad. Ultimately, I thought this was a pretty fair track overall. There weren't too many horses that raced on the rail that were supposed to do well that didn't. More so some long shots that didn't run well racing down on the inside. But it's one of those situations I do want to monitor moving forward. But just something to consider because Gallia Princess did spend part of this race on the inside. I don't think it necessarily affected her too much, but that could be the reason for that blue color coding in the race rating box. Let's talk about one more race from Aqueduct and really just a couple races left on our podcast rundown this week. And it's also a 3-year-old filly stakes race from Aqueduct, this one on Sunday, scheduled for the New York breds, the Maddie May Stakes. And seems like a pretty good set of New York bred 3-year-old fillies right now, or at least a few of them, Craig, particularly this winner, My Main Squeeze, who now earned her second triple-digit TimeformUS speed figure in a row. The last one was, I think, 6.5 furlongs, but she stretched out to the mile here. She'd already been a stakes winner going a mile as a 2-year-old, so distance doesn't seem like it's a major problem for her. And the margins between her and the second and third place finishers at the wire, they give you some confidence that this was a fast race. And as we kind of survey the landscape of 3-year-old fillies out there that are on the Kentucky Oaks Trail, Craig, she's not really running that much slower than any of them.
No, she's not running slower than just a few. I think I posted a list last week on Twitter. I don't remember, but there wasn't very many higher than this one. So she's one who obviously appreciated the extra distance. She had run at 2 back, as you said, but the pace was so slow that day. It's one that we upgraded with the P notation, but even that probably didn't do the race justice. She got a 92, jumped to a 106 last time, and then matched that 106 here. So she's a horse who seems like she could definitely go farther. I think Audible's a new sire, if I'm not mistaken, if not second year. So not a whole lot to go on with him so far, but she certainly looks like she can run for a while.
Yeah, I mean, this female family has been a really productive one for our trainer, William Buck Butler. I mean, in spite of Mama, I think she was a good horse racing during her career. She has now produced 4 foals. One of them was Rodney, who was a multiple stakes winner sprinting on the dirt for these same connections. He was by Run Happy, so a bit more of a sprinter. Another one's Mama's Gold, who won that $25,000 maiden claimer by 21 lengths. It took a while to get back to it, but he's been some big speed figures this winter at Aqueduct for a different barn. And My Main Squeeze, another one that this dam has produced, and she's really panning out now, this daughter of Audible. And Mike Maker did say after this race that they're going to try the Gazelle, and I think that makes sense. I mean, she's got to prove that she can get a mile and an eighth over this demanding Aqueduct track, but I don't know who else is pointing to that race that would be so formidable at this stage, Craig. And I'd imagine that she could be one of the favorites in that spot.
Yeah, no doubt. I could see that for sure. And as you said, to me, it looks like she'll handle the distance. I looked it up, Audible, the second-year sire. So I guess he hasn't been all that noteworthy so far, but it's still early. He's in New York. I would imagine he's going to get a chance to produce.
And we'll finish up this podcast with one race from Turfway Park. It was the feature race on Saturday, the Dust Commander, and Surly Furious, a horse that we've mentioned at different points, I think, on the forecast, and we're handicapping some races from other circuits. And mostly dirt races, I think, of when we've encountered him, Craig, and he's not always successful, but he's typically trying hard in those races. But he is really a synthetic specialist, and we don't see too many of those these days with them not running so many stakes and graded stakes races on synthetic. But I mean, when you look through his past performances, I mean, he is just a true synth lover, and he definitely loved to go like a Turfway on Saturday.
He did, and it's just that he's run some nice figures in the past, even on dirt, but mostly on synthetic. And I think this was a career best. He's getting a 122 for this effort. He's run a 120 before. He won his last race with a race that just had an incredibly slow pace in a sprint race. So not sure that one was even that figure was really relevant. I think the 122 is pretty solid for him here, going 6.5 or going a mile and a 16th, gave him a more true test. And I mean, when you win by 8 lengths on synthetic, it's almost like doing that on turf. It's pretty unheard of.
Yeah, this was a big step forward for this horse. Like you said, he's run some big speed figures in the past, but I mean, this was probably the best performance that he's put forth in his career. And there were some good horses in behind, and he just easily beat them. He is a horse that just seemed to get really comfortable over this Turfway synthetic track. And I've been watching some more races from Turfway this winter than I have in the past, sort of kind of forcing myself to do a little more synthetic handicapping and synthetic race watching, because it does feel like we might have some more synthetic racing in the future as opposed to less, just given the way trends are going in racing right now and some of the decisions that have been made in New York. So I've been trying to follow how some of these synthetic races play out. And you see a lot of this where horses like Surly Furious just get really comfortable with that fluid stride moving over the synthetic surface. And you could have seen a long way out that he was going to win this race. And some of these horses, when they just seem to get into that rhythm, they're just liking the way that surface is bouncing back at them on that day. They can run big races, and that's what was the case with Surly Furious here. So we'll see what's on the horizon for him in the future. Obviously, there are no major graded stakes for synthetic among the older horses these days, but there's enough of a circuit that he can do well in the future. We'll see what the connections decide to do with him.
Yeah, I just looked while you were talking. The horse who comes to mind is Wolfie's Dynaghost. He just popped back on the work tab about a week ago. So I would love to see those two horses hook up in a race. And I think there's an older horse on the big points race at Turfway. There's an older horse race. So maybe we'll get to see those two there.
Yeah, it feels like there should be some sort of synthetic championship, not like a Breeders' Cup. We don't need a dual Breeders' Cup, but I mean, like a mile race or a mile and 16th race, a Turfway or Woodbine could be fun for some of these horses to match up against each other. That maybe there's a condition that they've already been stake spinners on synthetics. You don't get these horses switching surfaces, but that might be a cool idea for a track to put in place. Well, that wraps up the Pacecast for this week. That's the end of the rundown, and things are starting to take shape on that Derby trail, Craig. Actually, just a couple of hours from now, I'll be recording this week's Derby Watch with Brad Free, and I was sort of wondering what price to make Sierra Leone. I ultimately decided on 8-1. I think the Derby future wager bettors, in terms of that future wager put out by Churchill Downs, they went a little overboard this week, making that horse 6-1. I think 6-1 on anybody at this stage in February is a little bit too short, especially a horse that hasn't yet run that fast speed figure like Sierra Leone. But I know people do like to latch on to a Derby hope early in the season and follow them forward. So we'll see all that plays out, but it does feel like things are just starting to take shape.
Yeah, we're getting there, and we're going to talk about on the Pacecast another race, or on the forecast another race which is going to get there, the Rebel, coming up this weekend. So things are going to come into focus. One thing to keep in note is, I mean, we're getting late, as I mentioned. It's getting late early, as Yogi Berra once said, the famous Yankee catcher, especially when most of these horses, it seems, this year are going to be running probably 2 preps. So there's not a lot of time, and you're going to have to make your judgments pretty soon, because we're getting to the round of preps where lately it's been in vogue to just kind of skip the last round if you have enough points. So you got to pay attention to these early races.
Well, that wraps up our podcast for this week. You did mention, Craig, the forecast, and we will be handicapping Oaklawn on the forecast. That should be out by Thursday afternoon this week. So these podcasts will be released a little closer together than usual. But the Rebel card, obviously, on Saturday, we'll be handicapping that late pick 5 sequence. So that's something to look forward to a little bit later in the week. Everybody, thanks for tuning in to the Pacecast this week. Remember, you can always catch these podcasts on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Again, thanks for listening, and catch that Timeform US forecast coming out on Thursday.